Hello and welcome to my video all about how to knit a wreath. I'm going to be using a combination of stockinette stitch and moss stitch to make a cover for a donut-shaped wire wreath form. I made my wreath form in a previous video, but obviously if you want to buy one instead, then feel free to do so. In order to get an idea of how long the knitted cover needed to be, I first measured the mid-size ring of my wreath form with a tape measure. This is basically the circumference of the wreath, halfway between the inner ring and the outer ring. In my case, the ring measured about 95 centimeters. If you wanted to make a fitted cover for the form, you could always incorporate increases and decreases. However, I'm just going to keep it very simple by flat knitting a rectangle shape. Because I made my wreath form, I have little bits of wire and solder that are sticking up out of the form. So in order to stop these from catching on my knitting, I first cover them in duct tape. Obviously, if you've bought your form, it's unlikely you'll have to do this, but there may be some areas where the wire can catch on the knitting. In order to knit this wreath, I needed 3 100-gram balls of yarn. The yarn that I chose was a super chunky King Cole acrylic yarn in the colour Red Currant. Each ball is 100 grams, which is 81 meters, and it recommends on the label to use 10mm needles, which I did. And even though I'm going to be doing flat knitting, I used circular needles because this is quite a wide knitting project and I couldn't fit all of the stitches on straight needles. If you remember, the circumference of the mid-size ring on my wreath form was about 95 centimeters. So the aim is to make the knitting no wider than that. I'll be using the long tail cast on method, and because I know this knitting project is going to be very wide, I need to leave a generous yarn tail. I ended up starting with a yarn tail about 2 meters long, just to be on the safe side. Then I did a slip knot, making sure the tail was towards me, and then started casting on the stitches. In order for the knitting pattern to work, you'll need to cast on an odd number of stitches, so that's the most important thing. I cast on stitches until the width of the knitting was just shy of the 95 centimeter goal. I personally cast on 159 stitches. Right, so let's get started with the knitting pattern. Because this first part of knitting is going to be at the back of the wreath and therefore unseen, we're not going to be doing the moss stitch pattern. Instead, we're going to do stockinette stitch because it's quicker. So to give me some idea of how long this area of stockinette stitch needs to be, I then measure between the mid-size ring at the back of the wreath and the outer ring. And in my case, it's about 7 centimeters. So now my aim is to knit a section of stockinette stitch that's 7 centimeters long at the most. Of course, for stockinette stitch, it's a knit row, then a purl row, then a knit row, a purl row, etc. And I end up doing 3 rows of stockinette. For me, this section ended up being about 5 centimeters long, and then I decided to switch to the moss stitch pattern. And it's this moss stitch that I want displayed on the front of the wreath. The moss stitch is a 4-row pattern repeat, and you knit it as follows. For row 1, you do 2 knit stitches to begin. Remember throughout that the working yarn needs to be at the back behind the needles for knit stitches, and at the front of the needles towards you for the purl stitches. We then need to purl 1, then knit 1, and keep repeating these 2 stitches until there's only 1 stitch remaining. So the yarn comes between the needles to the front, and we purl 1. Then the yarn goes to the back again through the needles to do a knit 1. And then you just repeat those 2 stitches over and over until you've just got 1 stitch remaining. Then you knit the very last stitch. Then to begin row 2, you do 2 purl stitches. Then you knit 1 by bringing the yarn to the back of the needles and doing a knit stitch. Then you purl one by bringing the yarn to the front of the needles and doing a purl stitch. And you repeat these 2 stitches until you've only got 1 stitch remaining. And then you purl the very last stitch. To begin row 3, you knit 1 and then purl 1. And you simply repeat these 2 stitches until you only have 1 stitch remaining. And then you knit the very last stitch. And then for row 4, which is the final row in the pattern repeat, you begin with a purl 1. Then you do a knit stitch, and then you repeat those 2 stitches until you only have 1 stitch left. And then you purl the very last stitch. And you can start to see what that pattern will look like here. In total, I did 4 moss stitch pattern repeats, which is 16 rows in total. Now that I've got enough knitted fabric to cover the front of the wreath, I now need to switch back to the stockinette stitch. We want this piece of knitting to be symmetrical, so I simply knit the same amount of stockinette stitch now as I did previously, which was 3 rows. I then finished off the knitting by doing the basic bind off technique. So that's 2 knit stitches, and then pass the first stitch over the second and off the needle, then another knit stitch, pass that lower stitch over and off the needle, and so on. Once you get to the last stitch and you're cutting off the excess yarn, make sure you leave enough of a yarn tail. This yarn tail is going to be used to join the short edges of the knitting together, so it should be at least 4 or 5 times the length of the short edge. Then take that yarn tail through the last stitch and tighten. I then decided to weave in the yarn tails, except for that last one. To weave in a yarn tail, you just have to feed that yarn tail into a yarn needle and then try and blend it into the back of the knitting. You do this by trying to follow the path of the yarn that's already in the knitting. You need to do this enough to make sure that the tail is secured, and then you can cut off the excess yarn. The next step involves joining the short ends of the knitting together, and I'm going to do this using a Bickford seam. If you want a more in-depth tutorial about the Bickford seam, then please see my other video. However, I'm just going to go through it quickly now. So what you first need to do is thread the yarn tail into a large plastic yarn needle. Make sure that the outside or the front of the knitting is facing you. You need to go to the opposite corner of where the yarn tail emerges from the knitting, and then take the yarn needle up through that corner. Then take the yarn needle up through the corner on the other side again, where the yarn tail is attached. And this forms a figure of 8. Tighten the yarn to bring these 2 sides together. There are variations about how to do the Bickford seam, but I'm going to go down through the loops and up through the knots. If you don't know what loops and knots are, then look at the very edge of your knitting and you'll find alternating loops and knots. The loops are a bit looser and you can more easily push the yarn needle through them, whereas the knots contain twisted yarns and they're a bit tighter. So I'm going to go down through a loop in the edge of the knitting, then cross over to the other edge and come up through a knot. Then on the same edge, I'm going to go down through the loop above this knot, then cross over to the other edge and come up through a knot. and you simply repeat this all along the edge. Once you get to the end, make sure that you've taken the needle through the corner on each edge, then take the needle under the yarn that goes between the two edges, from front to back. I'm then going to weave in this yarn tail. Funnily enough, this is actually a nice pattern for a scarf, so if you change your mind about making a wreath at this point, you can always wear it. Right, so the next step is to attach this knitting to the wreath form. When I'm joining the sides of the knitting together, I'm going to be using a different coloured yarn so that you can see it more clearly. Once again, you're going to need your large plastic yarn needle, and also make sure that when you wrap the knitting around the wreath form, you have the front of the knitting facing outwards. Then I'm simply going to join the two sides of knitting together at one point. So basically we're just doing a figure of 8 with the yarn to join the sides together. I'm then going to join the rest of the sides together using the simple whip stitch. To do this, you just go down through one edge of the knitting and then up through the opposite edge. And you just repeat this all along the edges. Because these first stitches are under the most strain, I put these closer together. Then I started spacing them further apart with about 1 inch between them. Try and keep this spacing consistent on both sides. If you feel like you've moved along one edge quicker than you have along the other edge, then in order to compensate, you can always make smaller stitches along that edge until it balances out. Basically, you're trying to move along both edges at the same pace. That way, the edges will line up neatly. Once you've completed the full circle, then just knot the yarn to keep it in place. Cut off the excess yarn and then use your yarn needle to feed the tails of yarn into the wreath and then back out again. This just buries those yarn tails out of sight inside the wreath. To add a hanging loop to the wreath, I used a piece of yarn. I used the yarn needle to feed it into the back of the wreath at the top, making sure that I also went under some of the wire frame. I then knotted the ends and that completed the loop. There are all sorts of decorations and variations that you can add to this wreath. You could try a different knitting stitch or pattern, you could try a different colour, maybe stripes, you could even make a candy cane wreath. Or you could add some embellishments, like these tiny pom-poms that I'm demonstrating here. However, I decided to make my final design very simple and just add a lace trim bow. So to do this, I got some vintage style lace trim and I made it into a bow shape. I then took a hand sewing needle and some matching thread, did a couple of stitches in the centre of the bow to keep it in place, and then attached it to the centre of the wreath. In order to keep the loops of the bow in position and stop them from drooping, I also did some stitches in the top of each of the loops, just to attach them directly to the wreath. And that's it, that's the knitted wreath completed. I really hope you've enjoyed this project and thank you very much for watching.